And I do apologize. Apparently, I did commit to talking about a different topic that I'm going to talk about this morning. I totally forgot about it.
Come back later.
Come back later. That's right. I've been working on this lately, and when Daniel contacted me, I didn't check my schedule, my calendar to see what I had actually written on there. And then this morning, lo and behold, I saw something different, the deaths of the Messiah, and I thought, ooh. But here we are. So the topic will be Abraham as a figure of disunity for Jews, Christians, and Muslims for the next couple of Sundays. So, of course, Abraham plays a central role in all of the monotheistic traditions. Right? In Judaism, he's tied to the promise of the land, he's tied to the covenant, practices like circumcision, very, very important figure. In Christianity, the events of his life are often used in the New Testament to prefigure the events of Jesus' life and certain Christian ideas and notions that are very important. And also within Islam, perhaps a religion you're less familiar with, he's often presented as a sort of forerunner to the Prophet Muhammad. And so we have him playing this really critical role in all three religions. To such a degree that, as I'm sure you know, it's not uncommon to refer to them as the Abrahamic traditions, right, or the Abrahamic religions. And that actually is a term that has become somewhat problematic for a number of people in recent years, especially. And the main concern is that they feel that perhaps by referring to them as Abrahamic, you tend to dilute the differences that exist among the religions, because Abraham doesn't function in the same way for all three religious traditions. And some folks have said, perhaps Abrahamic gives a wrong sense here, and it doesn't really allow us to appreciate the complexity of his character among the three religions. So some have called for perhaps replacing that terminology of Abrahamic with a different one. Nothing's really caught on that's been popular or accepted, but it is an interesting debate that's taking place. So what I'd like to do with you these next couple of weeks is to consider that term, Abrahamic religions, and why it is useful in some ways, but also it has certain shortcomings because of, again, the different roles that he plays in these three traditions. So this week, we'll begin by looking at him as a unifying figure, right? What is it that, with particular emphasis on the Quran, right? What is it that the Quran says about Abraham that makes this notion of Abrahamic religions possible, right? What is it that how is he a uniting figure? And then next week, we'll consider some other material where we can see that, again, he's not quite as unifying, perhaps, as many people would assume or maybe even like, right? So that'll be sort of the approach that we'll take over these two periods. I do have a handout here. Thanks. And so what I'd like to propose today is that Abraham is a figure, we can see him as a figure of unity and a uniting force, if you will, due to his belief, right? His belief in one God and how he puts that belief into practice, right? And in particular, I would suggest that his monotheism, right, his focus on the oneness of God, and also his obedience, right? How Abraham remains obedient to God despite the many challenges that he must confront. And when we talk about obedience, we're going to focus on that very famous scene in the Bible and in the Quran where he nearly sacrifices his son, right? And we can see how that's where his obedience is perhaps close to the fore. We have a couple of other focus coming in here. Sorry. I guess this one. Yeah, got a couple there. So just again, we'll start then with the notion of belief. What is it that the Quran says Abraham believes? He's mentioned some 25 chapters of the Quran. There are 114 chapters in the Quran. So more than 1/5 of them refer to Abraham specifically by name. And in fact, he is, other than Moses, he's the most frequently cited person in the Quran, which is rather shocking if you think about it. most people would think who would be the most frequently cited person in the Quran? Muhammad. You would assume that, right? Muhammad's name appears in 6,300 verses, which is about the same length as the New Testament. Muhammad's name appears a grand total of 4 times in the Quran. Really not about Muhammad at all. Now, he's referred to with titles like messenger and prophet and that sort of thing, but the focus of the text really isn't on Muhammad at all. It's on his message, right? And so Moses appears, gosh, I want to say maybe some 45 or 50 times by name, and Abraham is in second place behind Moses. So it's interesting to think about that in terms of just, again, the high profile that he has within Islam. Now, there's no chronological account of Abraham's life in the Quran. In fact, there are very few chronological accounts in the Quran of any biblical figures. We do get the Joseph story is there, so that's probably the closest we have. Maybe Moses a bit, but the Quran tends to sort of skip around and move from character to character as it's telling it's presenting its message. So we don't get an account of Abraham's life, and in fact, it's just selective parts that are referred to. And sometimes, and this is quite interesting too, the Quran will have more than one version of the same event. And so we do see that with Abraham, and we'll talk about that a little more next week, because that's where it's more relevant. So, and by the way, those different events are presented, or different versions of the same event, because the focus of the Quran is really on the message, right, rather than the plot, what's happening. And so we always have to pay attention to what message is being presented. And so sometimes it will tell a story with a focus on one message. Elsewhere, it tells the same story, but with a little bit of a different message to it. So what you have there on your sheet is on the front page, on the front side. These are some texts that highlight Abraham as a monotheist, and then on the back we have the biblical and the Quranic versions of the near sacrifice of the son, where I think we can get a feel for his, again, the obedience theme that's so much to the fore. So the Islamic view of, small map there. Oh, you got some right there. Okay.
Well, hold on.
Just one? Okay. We'll put some more. Sure. So the Islamic view of revelation really kind of supports the close connection between Abraham and Muhammad, and also the other prophets in the past. According to Islam, God spoke the same message to a group of prophets throughout history, and Muhammad is the final one, right? So if we look at the first text there from Quran 3, chapter 3, verse 84, we get a clear sense of this. Say, we believe in Allah, and Allah is simply the word for God in Arabic. What has been revealed to us, what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and what was given to Moses, Jesus, and the prophets from their Lord. We do not make a distinction among any of them, and to him we submit. So notice that Abraham is the first one in a chain of prophets, right, throughout history, and there's no distinction at all among all those different prophets. You see that first word, say. In Arabic, that is actually in the masculine singular, so it's telling an individual man to say this. And so this is a message that's directed to the Prophet Muhammad. So he's to tell his people that the message that I'm presenting to you is no different from the message of Abraham, Moses, Ishmael, Jacob, Jesus, etc. Right? So clearly, this is Abraham is meant to be a unifying figure, you know, in light of a passage like this, right? Islam is not a new religion, according to the Quran and according to what Muhammad taught. Rather, it's returning back to the way that the message that God gave to humanity throughout history that had been lost. So this is why this chain of prophecy and chain of these individuals is front and center here in the passage. Now, to dig down a little deeper in the next passage, also from chapter 3, a few verses earlier, we get a clear reference to Abraham and the role that he plays, and the way that he's presented here in Islam. Clearly, there are connections, but we can also see hints at some differences and distinctions, right? O people of the book, why do you argue among yourselves about Abraham when the Torah and the gospel were not revealed until after him? Will you not understand? You are those who argued about that of which you had knowledge. Why do you argue about that of which you have no knowledge? Allah knows what, and you do not know. Abraham was not a Jew or a Christian, but he was an upright person who submitted and was not one of those who associate. Very interesting passage here, right? Directed to the people of the book, that is Jews and Christians primarily, right? And notice the key role here that Abraham is playing. The Torah being, of course, the revelation to Moses, the gospel, the revelation to Jesus, right? And of course, the people of the book are the ones who have received that message. So what this text is saying, though, is that it's anachronistic. It doesn't make sense to refer to Abraham as a Jew or a Christian because he predated those religions. Rather, he's something else, right? So the text begins by saying what Abraham was not. And then it goes on to say what he was. And I'll call your attention in that last verse to that phrase, he was an upright person. That's the translation of a word in Arabic, that the word is hanif, and it's found 12 times in the Quran. And it refers to a person of high moral standing and character. Sometimes it's translated as a monotheist. I prefer to translate it here as just a good, upright person. And so what's interesting is it's found 12 times in the Quran. 8 of those 12 times it refers to Abraham, it describes Abraham, and no one else is ever called a hanif in the Quran. So this is a term that's sort of almost a technical term that's reserved for a monotheist like Abraham. So that's what he is. But notice how the passage ends. He was not one of those. First of all, who submitted. The word submitted is related to the word Islam in Arabic. Islam means submission. So Abraham is being presented as sort of a proto-Muslim here, if you will, right? And we see this very often with the biblical characters. They're presented as sort of Muslims, even if they live with a small m, because they submit to God's will, even if they lived before the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So he was a person who submitted and was not one of those who associate. Now, association in Islam is the worst sin a person can commit. It's called shirk, and it means to associate something with God, something in creation with God. And so association, according to the Quran, is the one sin that cannot be forgiven by God, to associate a human being or to associate something with God. Now, we're not talking about Jesus today, but you can see the implications here for Christian belief of incarnation and God becoming a human being, right? That's a topic for another day. We won't get into that now, but that's at the core of the issues between Islam and Christianity, the theological issues. Remember, I mentioned that the word Hanif appears 12 times in the Quran. 11 of those 12 times, it's immediately followed by the word for a person who associates. So they're contrasted always. And all 8 of the ones of Abraham, you have the same thing. He was a Hanif, he did not associate. So very clear, it's his monotheism here that's being stressed more than anything else. So the virtue of Abraham is contrasted with kind of like the quintessential sin of Islam, right? Abraham did not associate. And so this is the model that we should follow, right? And notice this is directed to the people of the book, right? So it's meant to be, the Prophet Muhammad is supposed to be speaking to Jews and Christians and saying, don't take him as one of your own. And who knows, maybe the reason why that's going on is because he sees the tensions between Jews and Christians on the figure of Abraham. And he's saying, rather, you've got to think of him in a different way, right? As this monotheist who did not associate. So it's an interesting, very interesting passage here. So clearly, he's an individual of high moral standing, right? And virtue and his spiritual quality is impeccable, right? And so he has a special relationship with God, does Abraham. And we see this played out very interestingly in the scriptures of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. There's a title that's given to Abraham in all 3 religious traditions, and it's really fascinating that all of them refer to him as friend of God. He's a friend of God. So you look at the Isaiah passage there, This is a text from Isaiah 41. You, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. You I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. So here the Israelites are presented as the offspring, the children of Abraham, who is the friend of God, right? This is God speaking, calling Abraham my friend. Then we go to the letter of James in the New Testament, and we see a very similar thing. The scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. This is from the book of Genesis, and he was called the friend of God. Very same title. And then finally in the Quran, from chapter 4, and who is better in faith than those who submit themselves to Allah, do good, and follow the way of Abraham the upright? Allah chose Abraham as a close friend. Isn't that fascinating? All three of the religious traditions, the scriptures, refer to Abraham using the same title. It's fascinating. Now, the word in Arabic for friend here is Khalil. Khalil, pretty common word in Arabic. And it's interesting that, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to visit Israel, but the place where Abraham, anyone know where Abraham is buried, or the kind of traditional place of his burial? It's a town called Hebron, which isn't too far from Jerusalem. It's in the West Bank, actually. And Hebron's name in Arabic for Muslims is Khalil, because it's connected, associated with the burial place of Abraham. So there's an interesting sort of popular usage of the term here, right? So Abraham is a paradigmatic believer, right? He's sort of again, the quintessential believer for all three religious traditions. So from that point of view, we could say, yeah, they are Abrahamic, right? Because all followers of these religions claim to follow the same God that Abraham did, right? And that's summed up very nicely in the last quotation here on the first page, on the front page, where we read from chapter 60 of the Quran, truly there is a good example for you in Abraham. You are to follow Abraham. And that, of course, although it's found only in the Quran, is a message that could apply to Jews and Christians as well, right? So again, wrapping up this first part then, from the point of view of his belief, there are so many connections among Jews, Christians, and Muslims regarding their understanding of Abraham, right? The other thing that really sets them apart, that all of them share, is this idea of Abraham as obedient, right? And in no other scene in the Bible do we see that obedience displayed more than in the near sacrifice of his son, right? This is and that's on the other side of your sheet. Sorry, the printing's a little smaller, the font's a little small. I wanted to try to fit it all on one page. I'm assuming that most of you are, perhaps all of you are familiar with Genesis 22 and the story, so we're not going to read through it. It's a little bit longer, but there it is if you need to refer to it. But I'm also assuming that most, if not all of you, are less familiar with the version in the Quran, like chapter 37 of the Quran. So I'll read through that aloud, and you can follow along, and then I'll offer some thoughts and observations about the two and how they both present Abraham as an obedient servant, but they do so in different ways. And that obedience is highlighted and underscored in a distinct manner in both texts. So here's the Quran passage at the bottom of the page. Abraham said, by the way, that Abraham said is in parentheses because the text doesn't actually say who's speaking, but there's no doubt that it's Abraham here in the Quran. So he says, Lord, grant me a righteous son. So we gave him the good news that he would have a patient son. When the boy was old enough to work with his father, Abraham said, my son, I have seen myself sacrificing you in a dream. What do you think? He said, Father, do as you are commanded, and God willing, you will find me steadfast. When they had both submitted to God and he had laid his son down on the side of his face, we called out to him, Abraham, you have fulfilled the dream. This is how we reward those who do good. It was a test to prove their true characters. We ransomed his son with a momentous sacrifice, and we let him be praised to succeeding generations. Peace be upon Abraham. This is how we reward those who do good. Truly, he was one of our faithful servants. We gave Abraham the good news of Isaac, a prophet and a righteous man, and blessed him and Isaac too. Some of their offspring were good, but some clearly wronged themselves. So here we have this is the only version in the Quran of the near sacrifice of the son. Again, I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with the Genesis passage. I'm wondering, maybe we could just take a moment. Anybody notice anything in terms of just looking at them in general terms of kind of comparing them? Yes, Rick?
Well, what struck me is that Isaac was referred to in the Quran. All my life, I just about been told that Ishmael was the son in the Quran.
Yeah, very good. In fact, if you look at the Quran passage carefully, you'll see that in fact the identity of the son is never clearly given in the Quran. He's never named. Right? Isaac's name only pops up here in verse 112, right, toward the very end, and throughout the whole story, it's simply the son. And so so this has been an interesting issue within Islam, the identity of the son who is almost sacrificed. In the Bible, there's no doubt, right? It's Isaac. And so within Islam, there was an interesting shift. Early in Islamic history, there was a tendency to say that, yes, just like in the Bible, it was Isaac who was nearly sacrificed. But somewhere in the kind of around the year 1000 or so, a little bit after that, they started to shift in the other direction to the point that now most Muslims would argue that it's actually Ishmael rather than Isaac. But yeah, that's a very interesting issue here. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, why perhaps the son isn't identified, which is an interesting gap in the text. Yeah. Yes.
God is using kind of a royal we.
Yes, very good. In the Quran, we find this quite frequently that God uses, and yet, yes, you're quite right to refer to it as the royal we, sometimes called the divine we, right? Where the Queen of England, the popes used to do this. In our last encyclical, we said this, blah, blah, right? The Quran often has the deity speak in the first person plural, yeah. But oftentimes within the same verse, it'll shift from we to he, or I. And so it's fascinating. There's no real clear, standard usage on that. Yeah. And of course, in the Bible, we find that, right?
Yeah.
Let us create them in our image, chapter 1 of Genesis. So and elsewhere in the ancient Near East, we see that very, very frequently, where deities will speak in the plural. Yeah.
In the Hebrew Bible, when God says we, is God sometimes referred to the heavenly host?
Yes, exactly. The divine court, perhaps, right? And we see evidence of this, for example, even though the we isn't used, like in the book of Job, right? Beginning of the book of Job, when the Satan figure, is on the earth and sees Job, then suddenly he's in heaven, but he's clearly in the context of a heavenly court, right? So this we might reflect this notion of God and the attending, courtiers, so to speak, who might be, if not in certain ancient Near Eastern religions, they might be gods themselves, or they might somehow be, again, attending to.
But not so the Quran.
No, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. We should never assume that the we here in the Quran is meant to suggest that there's a multiplicity of gods in Islam, and the Muslim commentators are always really careful to point that out and say this in no way is meant to say that there's more than one God. Yeah.
Now, is Abraham the one who, in some other story, said, God said, I'm going to destroy the city, and he said, well, if I can find 10,
Yeah.
just man.
Yeah, Genesis 18.
Please don't destroy the city. Well, if I can find 5.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even raise a finger when God says, sacrifice your son. So I always figured this story was meant to, that it was written in a time, there's a lot of child sacrifice.
Yeah, the Bible speaks about child sacrifice.
I think the point of this story is we choose to not sacrifice our children. That's not what God wants us to do.
Yeah.
So do Muslims think that the same way or not?
Yeah, I think it's more within, and this is true within Judaism and Christianity as well, it's more within the context of, again, his complete obedience and devotion to God, that he's ready to do something that actually is insane, right, for many people. And of course, in both cases, he doesn't have to do it. It's a very disturbing text, in the Bible and in the Quran because of what God is asking to do. But there are a lot of those texts, right, where God acts in ways sometimes in the Bible that are really off-putting. We say, well, how could this? Killing all of the Egyptian firstborn simply because, when Pharaoh was ready to let the people go, for example. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear to me that the son in the Quran is a little bit older because he's in war with his.
Excellent point. I'm glad you pointed that out. Yeah, when we start to dig down a little bit and we look at the two versions, we see some really interesting differences and distinctions there, don't we? And yeah, the son in the Quran, in fact, it sort of calls attention to that, right? Look at verse 102. When the boy was old enough to work with his father. The Arabic word there is a little bit slippery. That's the way I translate it, old enough to work with his father. But it can mean a number of other things, and including it could have to do with one's rational ability, right? It could mean when he reached the age of reason. In other words, he's able to think for himself. And I sort of like that translation for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment in terms of how then we can think about this text and what's going on. But yes, you're quite right. Yeah. Now, of course, the boy in the Bible has to be old enough to carry the wood, right? And journey with his father. Text doesn't really tell us. He's not a toddler, certainly, but how old he is, we're never told of that. Anybody notice anything else in the two versions that strikes you?
It's in a dream.
Okay, good. Yeah, in the biblical text, it says, first of all, notice how the biblical text starts. After these things, God tested Abraham. The reader has no doubt about what is going to happen here, right? God somehow is going to test Abraham. You don't get the testing dimension until, if you look at the Quran one, it's down in verse 106, right? It was a test to prove their true characters. So the reader isn't given that information until after the events, right? But you're quite right. Abraham says in the Quran in verse 102 that I have seen myself sacrificing you in a dream. And one of my favorite questions in all the Quran, what do you think about that? Well, how do you think someone responds? Like, my son, I'm supposed to sacrifice you according to a dream I had. Any thoughts on that? Well, Dad, you got to catch me first, right? Or something along those lines, right? But yeah, it's in the context of a dream, whereas here in the biblical text, in Genesis 12, we're not really sure, except we do get this reference in verse 3 to him rising early in the morning, right? So is that meant to say that this comes to him during the night? But hard to really know.
He didn't say, no, Lord, please don't let me do this.
Well, that's the very interesting thing about this this passage is the back and forth between the Father and the Son. And I think that is where we can see the Quran presents a lot of biblical stories, but it never presents them in exactly the same way. And it's always interesting to see how they're shifted around and modified slightly, because that's where we get at how the Quran is interpreting the passage, right? And so if we, again, look a little more closely at that, again, in verse 102, Abraham says, I have seen myself sacrificing you in a dream. What do you think? He says, Father, do as you are commanded, and God willing, you will find me steadfast. In other words, the Son is basically giving the Father permission to do what you have to do, right? So this is an interesting exchange between the Father and the Son, right? And notice what the very next words are. When they had both submitted to God and he had laid his son down, they said, we called out Abraham, right? That word submitted is almost a technical term in Islam because, again, etymologically, it's related to the word for Islam and Muslim. And so it's basically saying they submit to God's will, right? Now, what's interesting is, why is it, notice, they submitted to God's will. What is it that makes Abraham able to submit to God's will? Yeah, the son's response. Dad, I'm ready for you to do what you have to do. How about you, right? And Abraham, it doesn't say it in so many words, but it's basically saying that, yeah, the son's response to the father's question is what allows Abraham to submit. Yes.
That's a really good correlation between what happens to Christ and what happens with Abraham. So
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in Christian interpretation of Genesis 22, there are so many allusions and, as you say, connections that are made with the with Jesus and God as Father and this sort of thing. And again, the obedience and the submission. Absolutely, yeah. Jesus can play. He can be seen as both Abraham and Isaac, right, in that story in some ways. And so, yeah, there's a long, long history of that, and that's one of the reasons why this is arguably, I'd say it's in the top 5, certainly top 10 biblical scenes that have been represented in art, right? Because it's so rich in, in symbolism, and there are all those connections that you can make. So think about that. The son's response to the father's question is what allows Abraham to submit. Now let's go back and look at the biblical text, right? Is there a conversation between the father and the son in the biblical text? I know it's been a while maybe since you've read that. Yeah.
It's just between Abraham and God. God basically just saying,
Yeah.
this is what you're.
Yeah. Actually, there is one exchange between them. And it's also in the form of a question and an answer.
Where's the sacrifice?
Exactly. Yeah. If we go here, if we go to verse halfway in verse 6, so the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Another question and answer. But this time, it's the son who asks the question and the father who gives the answer.
And the son clearly doesn't know what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he says, okay, we got everything we need here for the sacrifice, but actually the star figure in the sacrifice is missing, right? And actually some Jewish commentators have devised a very clever way to read this so that Abraham doesn't have to lie to his son. So when he says here, Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." They say, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the burnt offering is going to be and there's no reason why you can't read it that way in Hebrew, because there are no commas or anything. And so he's basically telling his son, yeah, we've got one here. It's you, but you don't know it. And that's a very, very interesting way of reading the text. Yeah.
Is there any significance that there's so much more detail in Genesis? It's very
Yes, this is
detailed.
a very, very, it's one of the most detailed texts in Hebrew Bible narrative. And many people have commented on it. In fact, there was a famous study done by a guy named Auerbach, who actually was a classics scholar. This was done back in the mid-20th century, where he took this passage and he compares it to a passage in Homer in the Odyssey that also has a tremendous amount of detail. And it's a fascinating study to see what exactly they call attention to, right? And so this text, and notice in the Quran, we have virtually no detail, which is typical of the Quran, because the emphasis is on the message, right? It's not on telling the story. But yes, it's very, very clear that there's a great bunch of detail. However, we get a lot of detail, we get a lot of descriptions, but there's detail missing on something in the Bible that is actually quite interesting. What does the reader never know? We're bombarded with all these details.
Whether Isaac had any idea.
Yeah. The inner lives of the characters are never spoken about. We don't know what Isaac feels about his father doing this. We don't know what Abraham feels, right? It's all happening on the surface level with all these details, but we really don't get a sense of the characters' motivations, responses, reactions, concerns, or anything. It's really quite fascinating. One Bible scholar has referred to this as a passage that is fraught with ambiguity. We have a lot of information, but we don't, it's ambiguous about how the characters are thinking about the situation that they find themselves in. Yeah. Isn't it interesting that the Quran, despite the brevity, we don't lack that information, right? Because the son says very clearly, do what you have to do, right? So we know what the son's response is to in the Quran, but in the Bible we really don't get that. And in a sense, we know Abraham's response because it says they both submitted, right? When they both submitted.
How much access did Muhammad have to the written scriptures, or was his source mostly oral?
We don't have evidence of the Quran, a translation of the Bible into Arabic until the 9th century. And Muhammad died in 632, 7th century. So it was a good couple of hundred years before we know for sure that the Bible existed in Arabic. We assume Arabic was the only language that Muhammad knew. So there's certainly oral traditions.
Which could explain possibly the shortened.
Yes,
Arabic
absolutely.
version.
It could explain that. And it also could, this gets really interesting because one of the really popular theories now about why the Quran doesn't go into great detail on these biblical stories like this one is because it assumes, it shows us that the audience is already familiar with them. And so there's no need. So he's retelling them, but with, again, a different emphasis. And so the blanks don't have to be filled in because his audience knows them. That's a very, very common view now. It used to be that, oh, the Quran is this inferior text that's dependent upon on the Bible, and all these holes in it. But now more and more, I think people are reevaluating that position. Now back to the question and answer, the Q&A between dad and son. As we saw in the Quran, Abraham's question allows the son to submit. Can we say the same thing about Isaac's question to Abraham in the Bible? Notice again, he says, when Isaac says, where's the animal that's sacrificed? Abraham's response is, God will provide for it. Right? That's the first time Abraham really expresses some sort of faith and trust in God, that God will do this. And that's exactly what comes to pass, right? So is there a way in which the Quran and the Bible are sort of telling the same story, right, with a question and answer between father and son? Not idle chit chat, but it highlights, here in both cases, Abraham is able to come to faith as a result of that conversation. So who's being tested in the story is an interesting question, right? Notice in the Quran passage, it says in verse 108, it was a test. Now in brackets, it says to prove their true characters. Their true characters is not in the Arabic. That's been inserted by the translator. So it simply says it was a test to prove. To prove what? We don't know for sure. But it looks like in the Quran, both the father and the son are, in a sense, being tested, right? And they both pass the test because they both submit, right?
Well, when he says God will provide the land, isn't that just kind of very much misleading, Isaac?
Yes, we can read it that way. He
Lie
doesn't.
to him, maybe?
Yeah, he doesn't want to. He kind of is unable to tell him the truth. Absolutely. Or is it possible, in light of the way that the conversation between the father and son in the Quran works, is it possible to take that and apply it to the biblical text and say, well, maybe Abraham is also expressing a certain faith in God, that I won't have to kill my son. I won't have to do this horrible thing that I've been asked to do, but God will ultimately intervene, So it's just an interesting way of thinking about, if we look at what's happening in the Quran and then try to apply that to the Bible, does it allow us to think about the biblical text in a way that perhaps we haven't before, And so I think that that's one interesting aspect of the text. It sort of opens it up to that possibility. But you're quite right. He's not being blunt. The Abraham of the Quran is very blunt, isn't he? My son, I'm supposed to kill you. What do you think? Whereas in the Bible, it's like, well, God, we'll see. God will take care of it, that sort of thing. And so, he's obedient, right? right, in both texts, but the obedience is expressed in a very very different way. Yeah. So what do we make of the fact that the son is not named in the Quran? It's interesting. Isaac's name, Ishmael's name, is very frequent in the Quran. So it's not like, and again, if the readers are familiar with the text or the tradition, then they would know that this is a story about Isaac. But for some reason, the text doesn't name him. We see a similar thing in the Quran in another famous story about family members, and that's the story of Cain and Abel. Quran has one version of the story of Cain and Abel. I think it's in chapter 4, and it's very, very similar to the biblical account, but with some interesting differences as here. But the most fascinating difference is they don't have names. They simply are the killer and the killed. One son and the other son. I think what's going on there is that the Quran is trying to present them not as individuals, particular individuals from the past, but rather as representative of particular types of people. Because one son believes in God, trusts God, the other one doesn't. So it becomes a way then for the reader to perhaps more easily identify and see where they fit. Which son am I like, right? It isn't about these two guys, Cain and Abel, long, long time ago. This is a tradition about us today, right? I wonder if maybe the same thing is going on here, right? That the son is not named, so that the reader really has to reflect on, okay, this is an interesting story here. Would I be able to do what the unnamed son is doing and say, yes, Dad, if that's what God has told you to do, then I hope I can do what I can go along with that. Again, it may be, once again, that the Quran is trying to make the text as relevant for as large an audience as possible, right? Rather than specific, simply to tell a story about someone in these two people in the past. Any other thoughts, Rabbi, on this?
The two accounts end differently with what God has to say about it, so to speak. In Genesis, it comes as a blessing because
Yes.
of the obedience,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like at the end it's more just commentary
Mm-hmm.
on Abraham and his.
Yes, okay, that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's look at the way the Quran ends, right? We gave Abraham the good news of Isaac. That's the only place Isaac is mentioned, by the way. So does this mean that the story is about Isaac? Is Isaac the son? Well, go back up to the first Abraham's prayer. Lord, grant me a righteous son. In verse 112, it says, we gave him the good news of Isaac, a prophet and a righteous man. It's the same word in Arabic for righteousness. Does that mean that Isaac is meant to be the son? In other words, is this last verse, is this sort of summarizing what just happened? Or are we supposed to read it sequentially and Abraham got the good news of Isaac after this happened? We could read it either way, yeah. But if we read on, it says, and blessed him and Isaac too. Some of their offspring were good, but some clearly wronged themselves. That's talking about whom? Now we're no longer in the world of Abraham and whoever the son is. Now we're in the world of Muhammad, Jews, Christians. And so this is a text that then is meant to have practical implications. And in some ways, it's critiquing the people, the offspring. Some of them are good, but there are others who are not so good. And this is very, very common in the Quran to try to make a point. At the end of that Cain and Abel story in the Quran, it basically says after the son actually repents in the Quran, which he doesn't do in the Bible. And then the text says, this was so that this agrees with the teaching that whoever kills one person is as if they killed all of humanity, and whoever saves one person is if they saved all humanity. That's the Quran, way the Quran ends it, so that it has, again, universal implications. Yeah, the biblical text, what does that focus on? here too, your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. This is a text that's about Abraham and his offspring, right? It's not about humanity at large. And Abraham becomes, again, the starting point for the covenant, right? There's a lot of covenantal language here in the biblical text. Isaac is referred to repeatedly as your son, your only son. Now that's interesting because according to the Bible, Ishmael's already been born. He's 14 years older than Isaac, right? But Isaac is stressed as your only son, because he's the son of the covenant. He's the only son who matters, right? Whereas that's not part of the Quran passage at all. Why? Because the Quran sort of rejects this idea of God choosing one people over others. God doesn't, there's nothing in the Quran talks about the election of Israel, but says, but then they lost sight and went in the wrong direction. So it tries to present it as, again, a more universal story.
100%. Is the account in the Quran of Isaac's birth pretty much the same?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch
The
it.
account of Isaac's birth.
The account of Isaac's birth.
Isaac's birth. There is no account of Isaac's birth. Yeah. In fact, Isaac is Ishmael is the more important figure in the Quran and in Islam. We get quite a few references to Isaac. Thanks. Quite a few references to Isaac, but nothing to his birth. Now, that in itself is kind of interesting too, because again, it might be downplaying the covenant dimension, right? The idea that God is choosing this particular people and Abraham's line. You don't get that same thing in the Quran of again, God favoring one of Abraham's sons over the other son. And part of that is, again, because in the Quran and in Islam, generally speaking, God is the God of all people, right? And God doesn't express preference for some over others. But yeah, no, it's interesting what is in the Quran that's biblical and what is not. And this is very typical too, that what we see, it's a streamlined version of what we have in the Bible, and it's really focusing on a particular topic or a message, right? And the message here seems to be, to me anyway, is that message of submission, right? That the two of them submitted, and therefore they were rewarded by God. Whereas within the Bible, you certainly have that submission dimension, the obedience dimension, but it sort of goes in a little bit of a different direction with the covenantal language and imagery that's used.
So are you saying that Judaism, according to this story, is more exclusive than is Islam?
I think clearly, if we look at the whole notion of election, right, or God choosing, favoring Israel, favoring first Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, etc., down the line, is somewhat exclusionary in the sense that to choose Isaac automatically implies that you're not choosing Ishmael, right? And so God is clearly making a choice here, right? And so, there is some interesting work done on this where that has suggested that perhaps the monotheistic religions tend more toward exclusivity, simply because there's the notion of, one God with one blessing, choosing one people, and therefore there's a tendency or a propensity to do that. And so if we look at the biblical account, certainly divine choice and favor, is to the fore. But again, even though it's often not stated directly, that choice and favor implies lack of choice, not going with the other person. Yeah. Whereas again, the Quran sort of downplays that, and it's more what determines whether or not you are right with God is not biology, right? Or if you're in the right line, but whether or not you submit to God's will, whether you are a submitter. And this is why many Muslims would argue that Islam is a religion that's sort of true to nature, right? It's the universal religion because people have to submit. And in some ways, isn't that so true, right? Even if you're not a believing person, if you're not a person of faith, when all is said and done, you end up having to submit, right? And if it's only with your dying breath, perhaps, when you realize that, you're still going to realize it, right? That in fact, we don't have complete control over ourselves, our lives, what we want to do, that ultimately we all have to give in to something greater than ourselves. Call it God, call it Allah, call it, supreme power, supreme force, whatever. But in the end, humanity is by its very nature submissive, right? It has to be, simply because we are not, fully in charge, right? So from that point of view, I think that's why I find Islam, the message of Islam, to be such a compelling one, and an interesting one, is that in a sense we're all Muslims with a small m, and that the word Muslim just means submitter. That we all have to, ultimately acknowledge that we are not fully in control of who we are and what we do, and certainly how our lives end, and when they end, and that sort of thing. Yeah. And again, it's something that I think that we all experience, right, in our own ways over and over again in life. And so this story, I think, is very much, we can read it through that lens, that Abraham and his son, right, are these, they're personifying people who submit, who acknowledge that they're, they have to surrender their will ultimately to a greater will or a greater power. And that's, again, a message that we see over and over again in the text of the Quran.
Well, the Genesis story does end by saying, all the nations of the earth shall gain blessing for themselves. So that's a little bit more universal.
Yeah, it is, and that ties back to Genesis 12, when God first speaks with Abraham. God says, "All the nations of the earth shall be blessed in your name." Right. That's why his name is changed from Abraham to Abraham to reflect this idea that again, he will be the source of blessings for nations. Yeah. So you're right. There is sort of a universal dimension there in that, man, and that's what makes Abraham such a fascinating figure, right? Because you have all these different ways of kind of thinking about him, and you can appeal to him for a lot of different, see him as the sort of the model, or the symbol or the personification of a lot of different ideas. Now, one of the ones, I know we're getting close to wrapping up, and so I want to talk a little bit about what we'll be doing next week. So again, just to wrap up here, in these two ways, then I would suggest, through his monotheism and through his obedience, Abraham is clearly a uniting force, right? A uniting figure among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? There's nothing about the Quranic passage that a Christian or Jew would object to, right? There's nothing there that really is problematic from any point of view. So in that sense, and same thing, I think a Muslim would read the Genesis passage, and I have Muslim students in class now who have read these texts, and they don't raise any concerns or objections, right? So again, he is unifying in that way. But there are some aspects of Abraham's character in the Quran that make him less of a unifying figure. In fact, they somewhat challenge the idea that he is truly unified. And so we're going to look at some of those passages next week. And in particular, one thing that Abraham does, and this is not unique to Abraham in the text of the Quran, one of the things that he does in the Quran that strikes the Bible reader as very, very strange is that he clearly seems to be not just anticipating, but actually calling for the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. And so he becomes, if you will, a figure who is kind of setting the stage, anticipating, and helping to bring about really the coming of the Prophet of Islam and the religion of Islam. And this is an aspect of his character that, again, for the Bible reader is like, well, wait a minute, where is this coming from? And it raises some very, very interesting questions about, again, the role that he's playing in the Quran, but also important issues regarding, well, who owns these stories, right? Bible readers tend to take exclusive ownership of, the figure of Abraham and many other most other figures who are in the Bible. But here we have over in the Quran, we've got those same figures playing very, very different roles, right? And sometimes they're actually much more Islamic than they are Judeo-Christian. And so that really, again, gets at this issue of shared ownership of these various stories of the family, if you will. You know, I like to think about it as, okay, the Bible tells the stories from the perspective of the Isaac side of the story. The Quran's telling them from the perspective of the Ishmael side of the story, of the story. And we all know, right, when families get together, you talk about different traditions, that stories growing up happens with me and my siblings all the time. Hey, remember when this happened? Yeah, and then this, and so wait a minute, no, that's not what. Yeah, I remember that. You know, you kind of go back and forth. This is a very kind of I think it's an interesting analogy to think about the Bible and the Quran in that way, right? You have different sides of the same family presenting somewhat different takes on these important traditions.
Could I ask you a question that I've been thinking ever since you made the statement
Sure.
earlier along that line? First of all, I don't know the authorship of the Quran. Is it attributed to Muhammad?
Well, according to Muslim belief, these are the actual literal words of God that were delivered to the Prophet Muhammad over a 22-year period of his life, from about the age of 40 and about the year 610 until he died in 632. And according to Muslim belief, Muhammad was simply the recipient of this message that was given to him through the angel Gabriel, and that the text was preserved perfectly. And so it records the actual words of God to the Prophet Muhammad. So from the Muslim point of view, there is no author because it's simply a dictation from God. But scholars have studied the text, and it's there are all kinds of interesting, theories and ideas about perhaps, where this text may have come from. There's no clear agreement. The whole question of the relationship between the Quran and the biblical literature and other literature, Judeo-Christian literature, or traditions that are probably oral, is a whole other area that, again, people continue to debate. But from the Muslim point of view, it's really not even a question. It was simply recorded, right? And even though Muhammad was illiterate, according to Islamic tradition, it was recorded by his followers during his lifetime and eventually was assembled together into the text of the Quran.
And my second question is, I thought I heard you say that in relation to that sort of that Muhammad or these words from God were correcting the misunderstanding or the mishistory.
Right.
And what struck me is that is what Mormons believe
Yes,
too.
that's a very good observation.
And I spent a lot of time in Salt Lake City, so that's why I'm aware of that. Then the similarities are really great. Mormonism is correcting what Christianity got wrong, and the words came from
through an angel. Moroni.
To Joseph Smith. And somehow it was recorded.
It's a very, very close, a lot of similarities between Mormonism and the Book of Mormon and the Quran. Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't say Mormon. It's not Mormonism anymore. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yes, that's right. Yeah, but yes, that's a really good observation. And of course, Christians have historically done a similar thing with the Hebrew Bible, right? With the Old Testament, that Christians have tended to reread the Hebrew scriptures in light of their Christian belief and understanding, so that and we see it in the Bible itself, right? So the Quran is interpreting the Bible, but the Bible is often interpreting itself as well, so that you get the Isaiah passage about the virgin shall bear a child to conceive and name him Emmanuel, which is, in the book of Isaiah, then found in Matthew to refer to the conception of Jesus in a way that the original author of Isaiah certainly never would have intended that. And so in some ways, the Quran is doing a very similar thing to the Christian scriptures that the New Testament has often done with the Hebrew Bible. And then the Book of Mormon comes along and does a similar thing. So yeah, it's a very interesting way of common way of relating to previous scriptures. Yeah, to improve, or this is the new improved version. Great. Well, I think we are out of time, and I enjoyed our conversation. Some great observations and questions. And if you're able to join next week, we will take a look at how Abraham plays a somewhat less than unifying role in certain other places in the Quran. So have a good day and weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.